Protesters in Bahrain have held another rally against the normalization of relations between Israel and the rulers in Manama and the United Arab Emirates. Demonstrators voiced opposition against Bahrain's plan to open an embassy in occupied territories and reciprocal prospects of an Israeli embassy in Bahrain. On Tuesday, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates signed U.S. brokered agreements at the White House to fully normalize relations with Israel. All Palestinian factions and several nations have denounced the deals as a betrayal of Palestinian people and their cause. And joining us now for this news review is Robert Fantina, author and journalist, joining us from Kitchener, Ontario, and Harry Vox, investigative journalist, joining us out of New York. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program here. I guess we'll start there in New York with you, Mr. Harry Vox. Your thoughts on the story?
Well, we've got three of the world's worst human rights violators, Israel, Bahrain, and UAE, joining up. And we're supposed to celebrate this. Human Rights Watch called the Bahrainian, the conditions there as dismal, where torture is sort of standard, for legal procedure there. So this is a struggle between the people of the world and their leaders who've taken the money from these Jewish bankers that are coming from the trusts and the foundations secretly in these tax havens, and they're paying off these world leaders to implement this UN Agenda 21 plan and this new Silk Road with China and Russia. And ultimately, this is going back to these old banking empires. You judge a leader by the size of his yacht. And you got the king of Bahrain, his yacht's 230 feet. You got his crown prince, he's got 450 feet. And over in UAE, Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum's yacht, the Dubai, 532 feet. Okay, so the size of the yacht is directly inversely proportional to the degree to which they care about their people or they have legitimate rule. This is about money, always. With these Arab Gulf Emirates. This is about money, cash. And so they don't care about Israel, and nobody does. And I said this before, in the last time I was on this program, when it was the United Arab Emirates joining up for the money. I said that it's people versus their government. Get your pitchforks ready. And I see they did get their pitchforks and they protested. And this needs to happen across the Arab world. Everybody has to join up and fight this. And don't join up with Israel. Fight it.
Thank you, Harry. And Robert, I'd like to welcome you to the program. And to Harry's point, Robert, when the UAE announced it's going to normalize ties, we saw daily protests throughout the Middle East, including by Emiratis, saying that, hey, what our government does isn't, it doesn't really reflect on our sentiments. Bahrainis, basically said the same thing, and they protested and they condemned their government's decision. We saw the signing ceremony at the White House. More protests followed in the Middle East afterwards. Your thoughts on protests following to this very day?
It's interesting that the four nations involved, the UAE, Bahrain, Israel, and the United States, really care little about what their people want. They have other goals. Money, as your other commentator mentioned, geopolitical power, that's what they're looking for. Both the Arab countries that have recently normalized relationships with Israel were in a position to extract significant, if they chose to do so, regarding Palestine. They did not, simply because they wanted some of the weaponry that the United States sells that could only be accomplished if they allied with or recognized Israel. They wanted to line their pockets, and what they're doing will not help their countries, will not help the people in their countries. It won't do anything to alleviate the really terrible human rights violations that are occurring in their countries, and certainly it does nothing for the people of Palestine. But again, these are four nations who don't care about what their people want. They only care about what will empower them as a nation and as individuals in many cases. So we will continue to see these protests. I hope they grow. I hope they become extremely significant. In the United States, with the election coming up, that looks like it's going to be certainly, it will be a fraudulent election. Donald Trump is working hard to make it so. So there'll be little change there, and even if Joe Biden is elected, there won't be. But we need to see more protests across the entire Middle East and the rest of the world in favor of Palestine and in opposition to Israel.
Thank you, Robert. And Harry, to Robert's point, why is it, I mean, the U.S. was in such a strategic moment there, had an opportunity to actually do something good, get a heck of a lot of concessions for the Palestinians before these normalization deals. Why didn't it?
Well, because there's a few other agendas that are clashing with this. First of all, this whole pandemic is a plan that's been in by the United Nations, who's been subverted and undermined by the Jewish bankers in the City of London, and by the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum is all these billionaire groups who are pushing to install a total technocratic state where it's technology and microchipping, mandatory vaccines, which is nothing more than the international ID and stuff. So you have so many clashing agendas going on here that one thing I like to say about to reinforce what the previous guest said about whether it's Trump or Biden-Harris. Here's what you have to think about the Harris presidency, because it would be a Harris presidency if it wasn't a Trump presidency. With the Harris presidency, the Jewish bankers in the City of London just tell her what to do and she does it. With a Trump presidency, it has to also be good for Trump. So that's two criteria that must be met, whereas with Kamala Harris, President Harris, it's one criteria. They just tell her what to do, and she does it. So, they're both going to be enemies of that region. They're both going to be enemies of the Palestinian people. So we have to reinforce boycott. We have to boycott Israel, not join with them. Boycott Israel, not join with it.
Thank you, Harry. And Robert, your final thoughts on the story.
There is so much unrest in the United States now and in Israel about many conditions there. In the United States, it's about racism and police brutality. In Israel, it's corruption, Netanyahu's corruption charges, and the failure to adequately address the pandemic. So those countries have problems of their own, and it's been heralded as record-breaking recognition by Bahrain and the UAE of Israel. It may be record-breaking, but it's only temporarily refocusing the problems that those countries are having. Those demonstrations are going to continue until there is justice in those countries, despite how brutally those governments will repress them.
All right, good stuff, gentlemen. I want you to both stay safe. It looks like you want to get something in there, Harry. Go ahead.
There was never any problem between Bahrain and Israel anyway. So this is completely fake. There was no tension between these countries. They were essentially on the same side all along. This is all a show, dog and pony show anyways.
Which goes the same for the UAE as well. Thank you, gentlemen, both of you, for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you both on. Robert Fantina out of Ontario and Harry Vox here joining us from New York. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.